Hi, this is Josh Clark. I am the co-director of forensics and head coach at Montgomery Bell Academy in Nashville, Tennessee. And this is the lecture on the capitalism critique and focusing mostly on the policy affirmatives that the capitalism / neoliberalism critique will apply to this year. And today we're going to take you through a background of some vocabulary about capitalism and its critiques, and then we'll hop into strategy as well as the applications of the capitalism critique on this year's topic. So without further ado, well, everyone, this is Abram. He's dressed up in his Hulk outfit. Yeah, so with no further ado, we'll go ahead and start the lecture, and I hope y'all enjoy it. So like I said, capitalism and the criminal justice system. When we talk about the critique, the capitalism critique, we talk about the different points of clash that it's meant to create. The two main ways that you want to approach the issue is first, has the affirmative diagnosed what the problem is? And second, can we create a solution to the problem that competes with the solution that the affirmative has proposed? And so when we discuss the specifics of the capitalism critique and the criminal justice system, remember that we're trying to prove that the affirmative has not diagnosed the problem correctly, and therefore the solution will not be able to solve and has the potential to actually make things worse. So part one is going to be the definitional work. Here we have a quote from social anarchist Noam Chomsky. It says, "We don't use the term working class here because it's a taboo term. You're supposed to say middle class because it helps diminish the understanding that there's a class war going on." One of the interesting communicative strategies that's used to upset progressivism is this idea of class warfare. That the whole idea of there being differentiations in class and discussions of haves and have-nots is very quickly dismissed by this idea of class warfare. And that's just a communicative strategy that the bourgeoisie uses in order to prevent social uprisings that could upend the rich-poor gap that exists in the United States and the world at large. Before we move on, let's talk about what a critique is or a critique. Settler colonialism and various versions of anti-Blackness seem to be the predominant critiques of the last few years. A critique is criticizes the opposing team's plans, assumptions, or discourse on a philosophical basis. So oftentimes won't directly say that the plan is bad or that the plan is uniquely bad, but the plan may be part of a larger system that is bad, or have philosophical assumptions or epistemological assumptions, knowledge-based claims that come from a problematic place. When we talk about a criticism, there's generally three parts to it. Instead of uniqueness that a disadvantage would normally have, it's replaced by an alternative. So we have link and impact, which means that a critique is largely like a disadvantage, but the alternative is what is supposed to give the criticism uniqueness. Some shift away from status quo that makes the critique something other than a non-unique case turn. And that alternative generates that uniqueness in order to make the question of the critique unique in relation to the affirmative. So discussing definitions from this specific criticism, first we have to say, what is capitalism? Well, capitalism is an economic system. It believes in individual ownership and competition. The theory is that when everyone is selfish or acts in their own self-interest, it can benefit everyone. So by an attempt to accumulate wealth, it can generate the type of ideas and the type of innovation necessary to fuel and develop an overall economy, and creating the very notion of competition with the forces of supply and demand, driving market forces, is what is supposed to drive the economic force. And so self-interest as opposed to communal interest is important. And one of the things to note is that equality of opportunity is considered something that's important, as opposed to equality of result, or the fact that everyone receives the same. Adam Smith is largely attributed to be the father of capitalism, with his ideas of the invisible hand guiding the market, as well as the idea of laissez-faire capitalism, or kind of hands-off, the government hands-off of the economy in order to allow market forces to drive it. So what is socialism? There are a lot of ways to think about socialism. A lot of times socialism and communism are thought of as synonymous. When we talk about Karl Marx and Marxism, socialism was not supposed to be that. Instead, socialism was supposed to be the idea of a return to a good society, an anti-authoritarian state, and was supposed to establish a society composed of voluntary cooperating individuals. A reconstruction of that society in such a way as to make it the basis for true return to itself and the presence of those authoritarian forces which restricted and impoverished folks' minds. And so what's important in this instance is Marx saw socialism as a return to a communal state of living, but that it needed guidance and help in order to be able to make that happen. And so socialism was supposed to serve as a temporary state of the government where its primary goal was to redistribute wealth to the general population, and would exist as long as that was needed to happen. And the eventual goal was to get to communism. After socialism occurs and we kind of get all of the capitalist ideas after they're no longer socialized within us, then what occurs is what is able to occur is an economic system that no longer depends on the existence of a state. In fact, the state would be would be rejected. The state would dissolve, and we would live in communes, and we would share everything, and everything would be redistributed. In fact, if we were living in Marx's idea of communism, there would no longer be family units. All children would be raised by the community, and everyone would get to choose the sort of work that they would want to do in order to better the community. So today, where we used to strictly label this, this critique of our economic structures the CAP-K, today we talk a lot about neoliberalism. So neoliberalism is considered a stage of capitalism. And this newer stage of capitalism is the assumption that individual freedoms are guaranteed by the freedom of the market and of trade. And the freedoms it embodies reflect the interests of private property, which is, you know, the same as the ideas of regular capitalism, but to keep up with the forces of globalization that have happened post-Marx, neoliberalism would desire removal of various controls deemed as barriers to free trade, such as tariffs, regulations, certain standards, laws, legislation, and regulatory measures, and restrictions on capital flow and investment. And what neoliberalism seeks to do is spread capitalism and the ideology of capitalism um, through free trade and through the export and the development of new markets. So instead of kind of imperialism by the sword, it's imperialism by trade, by the spreading of ideas, and trying to create as many market spaces and create new market spaces as possible. So let's discuss a few more vocabulary words. The first is alienation. When you deal with Marx and post-Marxist discussion, alienation is a word that often comes up and might mean something different than you think. So with Marx thought that human nature is that working is imperative to human nature, and that our relationship with our work and our labor creates a condition in which we can become satisfied as people through our craft. And what capitalism has done is it's taken that means of production from the individual who would find satisfaction in the result of that work, and instead means we work in other people's factories, if we're talking about Marx and industrialism, or work for others' companies, and our ideas and our labor are taken from us, and what is replaced is simply a wage. And that divorce is supposed to create a fundamental deviation in the way that humans are supposed to be and supposed to find satisfaction in their labor. And that is oftentimes called alienation. And various forms of post-Marxist theories have developed other ways in which we may be alienated within capitalism, be it commodity fetishism, or the way that the familial unit works, or the way the criminal justice system works, for instance, that we'll discuss later. But it basically strips our ability to find meaning within the world and replaces it with artificial meaning, like the drive for commodities or the accumulation of wealth. Another one you'll probably hear is the proletariat. The proletariat is considered the lower or working classes, the members of which must, under capitalism, sell their labor in order to earn a living. Since the members of the proletariat do not own the product of their labor and do not have free access to the means of production or the means of communication, they are alienated both from the products they produce from each other. The proletariat, according to Marx, was supposed to be the group that rose up to cause the socialist revolution, or the worldwide socialist revolution. Obviously, with Lenin, then the creation of the vanguard, there's been one of other iterations that kind of deviate from that proletariat-led revolution, but nonetheless, the working class are the ones that are supposed to receive the worst of the situation under capitalism, and the ones that should or will rise up in order to destroy capitalism. Another one are the bourgeoisie. This means the trading middle class. This is the class of modern capitalists, owners of the means of social production and the employers of wage labor. And the capitalist class also includes persons whose remuneration may come nominally in the form of a salary, but which is in fact due to their position in the capitalist class. So it's one of privilege. Sometimes they are the kind of middle management, and they're the ones that oftentimes put down the proletariat and are therefore the subject of much criticism. The next thing I'd like to talk about is dialectical or historical materialism. This is also a vocabulary word that will come up a lot when you read about capitalism and socialism and Marxism. But this is a philosophical approach to reality derived from Marx and Engels. Materialism means that the material world, not like money, and it's perceptible to the senses, has objective reality independent of mind or spirit. And what that means with the dialectic is they take Hegel's approach of the dialectic, which is a historical perspective where there is a thesis and antithesis, and what emerges from the conflict of those two is a synthesis. And viewing the world through the lens of capitalism, through the lens of the haves versus the have-nots, they feel like they were able to find out that nearly all conflict that has existed in the world was derived from this battle over resources and the battle between those that have and those that have not. And it's remarkable through that lens how accurate much of Marx's description of history was, as opposed to Foucault's, for instance. Globalization should be a little bit more intuitive, but it's a key referent to the contemporary political discourse and a lens through which policymakers view the context in which they find themselves. Basically, the world is getting smaller and more connected via innovation and technology, and that much more world trade and connectedness is possible because of globalization, which allows for the export of capitalism and the American way of life through trade. Obviously, the value of globalization has been somewhat more questioned during the global pandemic as travel has decreased. By focusing on policy debate, we restrict ourselves to the issues of the day, to the tip of the political iceberg. What politics seem to me to be crucially about is why some issues are made intelligible as political problems and others are hidden below the surface, being defined as economic or cultural or private. When we talk about critique, and we talk about the critique of capitalism, we talk about the root cause or the underlying cause or the closest approximate cause to the problem that we are facing. And so now we shift to a discussion of criminal justice in order to try and interact the way that capitalism influences and drives our criminal justice system. So when we discuss these things, there are lots of articles that are coming out of late, driven by a lot of the protests that are happening, that criticize some of the reaction, some of the ideas that changing the criminal justice system will somehow rectify the situation. But there are other articles like this by Elise Sperry that have come out that say the criminal justice system is not broken, that instead it's doing entirely what it's designed to do. And another that came from the CJPC News that says, are corporations the cause of incarceration? No, but capitalism might be. So when we think about that, how could capitalism be what drives our criminal justice system? And why would that, as opposed to maybe an abolishment lens, be something that's more prudent in terms of exercising it? Well, the first might be to consider what it is the criminal justice system is punishing folks for. And the answer might be that it is that capitalism is what defines private property and ownership. And even the basis on which our Constitution was created could be argued was created in order to sustain the status quo for those who were the richest landowners in what we now know as the United States at the time. And if the goal was to sustain private property, sustain the wealth that had been accumulated by the few in what is now the United States of America, then the idea of a police state and the emergence of a criminal justice system in order to continue the protection of private property and the protection of those in power can be more understood. And those that would not comply or fall in line to exactly the way that the society had been mapped out by those in control and those with the resources would be considered not tolerated and set aside in society so as to not cause problems. So if you are a threat in order to rise up and create and demand more creation for freedom, then it could be seen as a criminal justice system is used to prevent those uprisings and used to prevent those movements from happening in the status quo. So criminal justice spending increases as capitalism advances. In an advanced capitalist system, much of the population becomes superfluous to the economy. Thus, the criminal justice system is created to legitimize capitalism and control the surplus population, which threatens to disturb the system, which is a little bit of what we just talked about. Was from an older article from all the way back in 1979, but couldn't be more on point with some of what we have talked about today. I'd like to talk about, here we have a model of capitalism and education, and the way that it influences our criminal justice system, where you have sponsoring lobby groups that then pressure politicians to pass punitive laws, that then go to courts, that then sentence more people, and that then produce more funds, which sponsor lobby groups, etc. Before we move on to the specific link arguments that we'll discuss today, I would like to show a film.
Well, I think that at the essence of neoliberalism is the notion that that the essence of democracy is basically about making money, that the market is a template for all social relations, that anything that doesn't fit into market values, it really basically doesn't count, that there's a massive transfer of public wealth to private hands, there's an ongoing attempt to privatize almost everything, there's an attempt to deregulate business, there's an attempt to basically hold back all those institutions and organizations that speak to the public good, whether we're talking about education or we're talking about unions or we're talking about social provisions. So, I mean, I think overall what you're seeing in neoliberalism is an attempt to basically completely undo the parameters of the public, to do away with all notions of the public, whether it's an ideology, whether it's a mode of transportation, or whether it's basically a mode of solidarity, and to utterly privatize those things so as to assume and to claim that the only thing that really motivates people is really making money, that profit is the essence of all human relationships. We've lost the language of compassion, and we've lost the public spheres that nourish it, and we've lost a media that has any interest in it. In a world in which sovereignty is now corporate rather than political, and corporations define values, and corporations define social relationships, and corporations define what matters in life. What matters is money. So you get sick, I mean, I'm going to reward the person who works for me in my insurance company for making sure you don't get the treatment you need because that's going to save me money. Somehow economics now drives politics, and economics has completely divorced itself from any sense of ethical considerations and social cost. Young people are basically in a position unlike they ever have been before. I mean, given what is the social disinvestment in young people that's gone on since the 1980s, is really quite remarkable. I mean, in my vocabulary, I call it a war on youth. And the war on youth takes two forms. There's a hard war and a soft war. The soft war is the war of endless commercialization and commodification. Kids are treated as commodities. They're told that the only thing that really matters is buying and selling. They're bombarded every day by an ideology in multiple forms, on multiple platforms, that tell them that self-interest is the ultimate interest, and that what really matters is buying and disposing goods, and advertising goods, and branding themselves. The hard war is a war in which increasingly what we find are kids being punished in ways unlike we've ever seen before. We have the school-to-prison pipeline where you've got endless numbers, and when I say kids, young people, I'm talking about low-income, poor minority students. These students have become disposable. And as a disposable population, there's almost no investment in them except basically to get them out of the way, put them in schools that basically contain them, and once they get out of those schools, then they find themselves basically in what we might call the mass incarceration state. I mean, we live in a country in which more people are in prison than any other country in the world. And not only that, we live in a country in which there are more people in prison at this time, 70% of which are people of color, than there were in Stalin's gulags at its height. So I think that what you see here is as the social state is diminished, as the welfare state and all of the funding that goes into it for not just social provisions like Medicare, but also schools and so forth and so on, you see taking place the rise of the punishing state. The punishing state compensates for all these gaps. Because think about this: all of a sudden you have kids who are unemployed. You have what we call a zero. This is the zero generation. Zero hope, zero employment, zero futures. And it seems to me that these kids, they have there's no spaces for them. And the only spaces that we find for them, the default space, has now basically become the prison. So you have something called punishment creep, where the model of the prison now begins to seep into other institutions. And you see it particularly in schools around zero tolerance policies, where kids are being, cops, there are more policemen in schools than there are teachers. And what you see is kids being handcuffed, put in the back of police cars for violating dress codes or for doodling on their on their desk. We're not talking about 17-year-olds. We're talking about 10-year-olds. What kind of language nourishes the notion of civic life? What kind of formative culture has to be in place? What kind of public spheres have to be available? What kind of institutions have to provide support for people to be critical, to engage in dialogue, to participate and believe that what really matters is not only a sense of self, but a sense of social responsibility? And increasingly what we've seen for the last 35 years is an ideology that had basically completely undermined that sense of social responsibility. Think about it. We have right-wing Republicans in the United States Congress and in Senate saying things like, kids who get free lunches in schools should be forced to work. We have people saying that, grasping onto this logic of rabid individualism and individual responsibility and this absolutely eviscerated notion of freedom, right? It's freedom from, not freedom to, right? Freedom is a negative force, right? That people are ultimately responsible for their own fate, as if larger structural forces don't exist, as if the problems that people face, for instance, massive pollution, is caused by me, and not by the major corporations. And so there's what we've seen disappear in this discourse, which is to me the essence of the problem, is an inability to translate private troubles into larger structural public considerations. We have no way of understanding that link anymore, because what we've done is we've defined freedom in a way that suggests it's the freedom to do anything you want and screw everybody else. We've defined self-interest as the ultimate measure of what it means to take responsibility for yourself. We've made the claim that social responsibility is a pathology. But what you really need is, you need a new birth, right? We need somebody else. We need a party that really says, hey, look, we don't believe society should be defined by corporations. We don't believe in this massive inequality in wealth and income. We believe in justice. Justice is something that shouldn't be bought. Everybody should have the basic social provisions that expands the possibility for their own agency. Everybody. That's a social issue. That's not just an issue of individual responsibility. So I think we have to draw a new map. We have to in some way embrace a new set of policies. We saw hints of that with the Occupy movement. We saw hints of it with the Quebec student movement, this year. We see hints of it in the No Idle movement among indigenous populations in Canada. And I think that, that's a long march to the revolution, to the institutions. It takes time. Education is at the center of politics. It's at the center. It's not just something that happens in schools. It happens all over the place. It happens in the cultural apparatuses. It happens here in terms of this interview. It happens in terms of how corporations try to define what counts and what doesn't. And education has to be reclaimed, and it has to have a very different mission and a very different purpose and a very different set of practices. It's not about methods. It's basically about educating people in ways to enhance their sense of critique, to expand the critical imagination, to lead them to believe that they can think in order to think otherwise, in order to act otherwise, they have to think otherwise. And it also suggests that they have to do it collectively, that they can't do it individually. So you need a formative culture at work that once again reclaims all those things that matter in a civic culture: compassion, justice, equality, the ability to relate to others in a way that expands and deepens the very process of democracy itself. And secondly, you need social movements that are broad-based, broad-based. We can't, identity politics is fine, and it addresses specific issues, but we need broad-based social movements that address the totality of society. I think you got to live standing up rather than on your knees, you know? I think you have to believe in something other than yourself. I think that you have to believe that the world can be a better place and you need to fight for it. I think you have to believe that you can't do it alone. You have to do it collectively. And I think you have to believe that justice is going dead in us all the time, and we have to find ways to revive that. And we have to do it in ways that's compassionate, engages the notion of social responsibility, takes seriously what it means to be intellectually alive, and always to spark the imagination, and to always take risk.
As Giro said in the video we just watched, that the criminalization of any movement or thought or behavior or culture that runs counter to the Eurocentric capitalism can be considered a threat, and that the way that our system is set up is to control and punish those threats to the system as to curtail a form of education and social consciousness that might actually engage in critique of the system and the way that it exists. Drew mentioned that how this form of ideology permeates all aspects of our society, not just the criminal justice system, but that it especially targets the youth. And one of the things that I liked about what he said is that that focus on education. And when I hear him talk about education, I think of framing. How he mentioned that it isn't just the it isn't just in the classroom that's important, but every educational space in order to raise consciousness and engage in critical thought and have meaningful discussions that can make a critique of neoliberalism something that can be successful and transformative. And that only when we enable that sort of critical thought that can challenge that ideology that's possible. And he mentioned, the past 35 years that there's been a criminalization of those thoughts itself, and that they've been policed by each other and supported by the ideology that is permeated. That is that individualized self-interest is the only acceptable tool, and that people, the proletariat, should work against their own interest in supporting the power relations of the status quo. So when we talk about that, it's a natural transition to go to framework. I think that one of the best framework arguments that you can use when discussing capitalism is that of epistemology. And I think that's similar to the abolition criticism as well, because epistemology is the study of knowledge. And so it's important to know how our knowledge was created. Now, I don't think that you need to win epistemology framing in order to win the capitalism critique, because I do think that a lot of the link evidence will be sufficient to go tit for tat in winning that the plan would be a bad idea in permeating and legitimizing capitalism. But when teams kind of say, we need to combine the anti-capitalist movement and deal with one symptom of the capitalist class, be it through their plan, it's important to know that we need to compete based on the ideology, and that one of the things that Giroux mentioned and this McDowell 17 evidence talks about is that the way that we approach this knowledge creation in terms of identifying the problems and ideologies behind it, it isn't punishment that permeates society, according to this critique. It is, the logic of wage labor. It's the logic of poverty. It's the logic of the rich-poor gap that creates the necessity for the punitive system to exist in the first place. And when we talk about punishment as the root of the problem, it obscures it, because the system can change into so much in order to regulate and find other ways to keep the population as whole, consuming and creating debt and being dependent on corporations. in order for their livelihoods. And that is the knowledge creation that's important. So if you can win that sort of competition, then permutations become a lot more difficult in order to do it. On top of that, you can, if you win epistemology first, then sometimes you don't need to win the alternative. If you win that their knowledge creation is undesirable, then you don't really need an alternative to that knowledge creation because you can just vote negative to say that their knowledge is both bad and undesirable. And then just a simple thought project would be necessary in order to generate the necessary uniqueness to solve. And so winning this epistemology framework can be extremely strategic when it comes to the capitalism critique. But let's look at specifically what this McDowell 17 evidence says. It says the carceral habitus limits political imagination of what is possible, only prioritizing epistemological critique that allows thinking otherwise breaks this cycle. And in the emphasized words, in other words, if language structures the way that we think and act, troubling the binaries, carceral safety depends upon centering meditation as a means of dispute resolution and finding ways to express and co-hold feelings of shame, trauma, and vulnerability are ways to build a communicative structure that can support community-generated responses to harm that do not rely on the logic for carceral safety. Again, at the end, these passages suggest ways that interdependence and an epistemological orientation grounded in trust, mutuality, and shared vulnerability could bring into an insurgent mode of community that counters the logistics of carceral safety. Basically, changing this individualized perspective that the idea that the criminal justice system is flawed, instead realizing that it's doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. And only when we shift from individualized thought to communal priorities can we change this sort of prioritization that makes criminal justice really inevitable within that framework. And challenging that knowledge creation can be key. We're now going to move on to 3 link arguments that I think are great. And I don't think they're by any means the only link arguments, but I think that they're 3 of the good ones that we've discovered in the literature. I do think that one of the great things about the neolib/capitalism critique is that you can find specific links to almost any impact that you can claim to solve, as well advantage areas and especially plan action. There's enough people writing about Marxist and post-Marxist and neo-Marxist and post-structuralist Marxist theory that you can find someone that discusses nearly every single policy and criticizes a systemic capitalist approach in order to deal with said policy. I remember in my first year in college, all the way back in 1999, my partner and I, before there was good access to the internet, would go to college libraries as we'd go to college debate tournaments, and we'd just go scour books, and we were able to find extremely good Cap K links on these college campuses in books before rounds started in order to be able to answer the cases we were going to debate that weekend. And I just think about how much easier it is for you to be able to access online journals and books through the library system or different socialist journals and newspapers that speak about so many different subjects. So one of the great things about this critique is that you can find really specific literature that engages the critique. But let's talk about these 3 more topic generic links or topic specific links, depending on how you view it. The first one we'll talk about is legitimation or legitimization. The Shept in 18 card discusses the focus on softening how the criminal justice system punishes, naturalizes the neoliberal social relations that sustain carceral geographies. So kind of when we're discussing neoliberal racial capitalism and its concerns with the challenges that could exist in its legitimacy, one of the kind of responses to that is to resolve to resolve the punishment aspect of that. And the important part of that is that they do not need to rely on this discourse of punishment in order to discuss that. The reason is because if you get rid of punishment, then you'll you'll probably move to instances of kind of behavioral regulation, um, kind of the creation of things like reflection cottages and justice campuses and gender responsive prisons and the mental health jails that can exist, all in order to try and control the general population, as opposed to just directly punishing. It basically engages in different forms of propaganda to show what is a proper citizen. And that social control um, can be an entire political project that further ingrains neoliberalism and capitalism within the general population. As it says on this screen, that the political project of rethinking will fail so long as terms we use to describe or denounce them hinge on the assumption that prisons emerge out of the logic of punishment. The problem is that prison's regime is rendered itself correctable or reformable within that framework. And what that does is it leaves the logic, relations, and interests that do actually produce prisons, prisoners, and carceral state wholly intact. So the argument is that the abolition movement um, would serve to legitimize capitalism uh, and legitimize neoliberalism and the unequal socioeconomic conditions that exist, because it would leave those things intact. It would show that reform is possible within that system. All the while, all of those bad things that created that carceral system in the first place still exist. And meanwhile, people are being tracked and people are in reconditioning programs, all in order to try and recreate that same system that has created that inequality in the first place, that have set the conditions for quote unquote crime to occur. So that's uh, the legitimizing the system is the first link. The second link would be to increased private control. This is Takei evidence, 17 evidence, and it says that a successful left or right alliance to end mass incarceration would rearrange the carceral state, replacing mass incarceration with a new paradigm of mass control. And the way it would do this is by increasing the supervision of 50% or however many people were no longer in prison, and that racial minorities would continue to be arrested and prosecuted. And then under this new mass control paradigm, they would remain in communities but be marked and tracked by the criminal justice system. So this marking and tracking of these individuals would still eliminate them from the prospects of participating in a capitalist economy and regulate them in much of the same way that would prevent them from being able to fully participate, and making them overall expendable to that system. And what the specific piece of evidence that we have in front of us says is um, that replacing half of all prison sentences with equivalent terms of supervision would increase the supervision population to nearly 5.5 million. What the piece of evidence goes on to say is that this would close over half of prisons, depending on what the advocacy of the plan text would be, and it would create private control over these rehabilitation programs, and that private control would have economic self-interest in keeping those people within that system and creating conditions that they can never get out of because they have an economic incentive to keep them in those rehabilitation programs. What that would cause is a proliferation of people who would be considered criminals, even if they're not currently in prison, that would create conditions in which more and more crime or quote unquote crime would occur, uh, and would lead to re-imprisonment and a need for massive amounts of new prisons. The only problem, is what this piece of evidence says, is that all of the public prisons will have closed, and so a rapid increase in prisons will be needed in the second wave of imprisonment and increase in criminal justice, and that these second wave prisons will have to be created in a very short amount of time and will therefore also be private. And then the corporations of rehabilitation and private prisons will work in cohort to make sure that it can be as profitable as possible, keeping people in the system permanently, meaning that it will replicate the problems and make the prison system more insidious, being entirely private controlled due to self-interest of corporations. All right, so I like that one. Because of the second wave type impact that says that more people will end up being incarcerated. The last one is the panopticon. It's this Waquant intent evidence that talks about revanchism. Revanchism, if you're not familiar with the word, is kind of reclaiming or taking from someone what you feel like is yours. And revanchism as public policy toward the dispossessed has thrust the economy into a historical cul-de-sac as the double coupling of hyper-ghettoization, hyper-incarceration on the one hand, and workfare and prison fare on the other damage both the society and the state. The evidence goes on to talk about the creation of a panopticon in which it says that the reversing the racialized penalization of poverty requires a different policy response than mass incarceration would and calls for an analysis of the political obstacles to this response, which must go beyond trickle down penal reform to encompass the multifaceted role of the state in producing and entrenching marginality. Saying that this form of panopticon measures include the diffusion of official rap sheets through the internet, the routinization of background checks by employers and realities, and the spread of public notification statutes, and a shift from old-style fingerprints and mugshots to DNA prints coordinated by the FBI, basically creating an entirely new form of panopticon that watches its citizens and is able to characterize and criminalize those that are undesirable, which has the ultimate effect of preventing movements from happening in the future, because anyone who would like freedom away from capitalism in order to try and thrive outside of capitalism would be hindered in their ability to do so because the panopticon would have ultimate ultimate view and control over them through that kind of radical increase in knowledge. And so this shift from punishment to kind of more of rehabilitation and monitoring could be even more insidious and do more to prevent movements from solving capitalism. So we've gone over three pretty good link arguments that have some overlap but also have some distinct features. Again, I encourage you to find specific links to various AFs and the impacts of advantages because I think that it's something that's very helpful. But what about an alternative? Here, this picture, I have a picture of the movie The Trotsky. Probably most of you have not seen it, but it is about a young man who thinks that he is the reincarnation of Lenin and tries to unionize his school. The idea behind it sounds far-fetched, but watching a prom that has a school dance that has a social justice theme to it is something that I think that progressives could use more of in terms of education and creating different discourse about what the possibilities of a different world might be in the context of this critique. When we talk about alternatives to critiques, generally we talk about the weakest part of the critique. It's easy to say capitalism is bad. It's difficult to say what a future world of non-capitalism would look like, as well as what would be the exact transition to get to such an desirable state. So I would suggest when we discuss alternatives that that these three would be, or four that we'll discuss are good possibilities to consider. Now, one movement that I am not as big of a fan of that I think a lot of others are to fiat some broad-based movement that has the potential to generate some real uniqueness and to solve aspects of whatever the critique of your harm is, in this instance, capitalism. I find it as a critic, I find the permutation in those instances incredibly persuasive. I think that the idea that the plan would somehow have a large effect over a fiated movement, very unconvincing. And I think that if it is sufficiently widespread, that movement could very well solve a lot of the links or a lot of the concerns that we could have, and the plan would be largely couched in the terms of that movement that would prevent the type of pacification that your permutation answers would be in need of to answer that movement. Um, the problem with the types of alternatives that I prefer are that they don't solve as much. They're generally first steps along the way in order to solve. But I don't see alternatives in the light of they are necessary to solve the harms of the criticism, merely to generate sufficient uniqueness to make the offense interact with the case in a slightly unique manner. Because I think that a critique like capitalism can generate ultimate defense, and by controlling the root cause, and just needs a little bit of uniqueness in order to make the offense outweigh the risk of solvency. So the ones that I've isolated first is this Mera and 14 evidence. It is about diagnosing the problem. When we started the lecture earlier, we talked about diagnosing the problem. If the problem is punishment, or the problem is policing, if the problem is foreign or forensic science, then you've identified arguably what is the wrong um, disease to fight. And if you make an analogous to healthcare, if you've identified one disease but it's another, it's rare that it will help and actually has a possibility of hurting by treating the wrong disease. And at minimum, you've delayed the necessary response a certain time that allows that disease to spread even farther. So diagnosing the exact problem or what the true problem is can in and of itself be an alternative that differentiates itself from a permutation, because you've said that capitalism is the problem while they've clearly identified punishment as the problem. The reason that this isn't with this alternative, it would be really important to win your framing argument about epistemology, because all of the knowledge creation of the 1AC would be relevant and necessary in order to create competition with a diagnosis type alternative. The next alternative is that we can talk about is historical materialism. There's this Xenakis card from 18 that talks about the alternative as a counterfactual analysis of neoliberalism's role in criminal justice system aimed at producing an alternative pedagogy. Challenging the underpinnings of punishment is a prior question to the affirmative method. The reason this is good is because it embraces historical materialism, seeing the criminal justice system through the lens of the haves versus the have-nots, and the creation of private property, and the developers of the Constitution, or the founding fathers of the Constitution, as people who are trying to solidify property rights and solidify the wealth that they'd incurred in the development of this new nation state, basically to keep the status quo as it was, with the priority of the creation of the government being that. There's a funny, in 1995 Michael Parenti book, there's a funny political cartoon that has the founding fathers writing, we the people, except it was originally we the white, heterosexual, male, cisgendered uh, landowners, and someone was like, that's too long, and then they just write "We the People," even though that's really what they meant in writing the Constitution, or so the capitalism critique would argue. What historical materialism or dialectical materialism would see is that it would take, Hegel's vision of the dialectic and the perspective of materialism throughout history, and see it through the lens of the haves versus the have-nots, and see the way that the criminal justice system would have emerged by that. And that kind of knowledge creation can create the conditions in which we create a real solution to the problem, as opposed to dealing with the symptoms. Next is a systematic critique. Vote negative. because only systemic critique solves the root cause of the advantage. This Hagevian 6 evidence is a basic piece of evidence that is targeted in order to just create a little bit of uniqueness by engaging in critique. This is similar to what Giroux was talking about in the instance of creating greater social consciousness and daring to engage the ideology that goes unquestioned, and that there's been a top-down war against creating those types of questions um, to prevent people from challenging the overall system. So I said that I'd mention a movements one. I do think that there's a goofy philosopher who's definitely gone out of vogue in the debate community for various reasons, that he and his followers write some evidence that says that we should act individualized as if we are a part of the socialist revolution at all times. And that's a way of kind of discussing movements and the importance of movements while focusing on the role of the individual in the development of those movements. And I think it also creates some good answers to permutations because it's relentless. It's not supposed to give an inch, and so giving an inch in order to accept one capitalist policy would be uh, the type of action that could create the movement to desist and would trade off with that individualized action. And so acting like that in all instances could be a good way to request that the judge acts, especially because it's responsive when someone asks who does the alternative in this instance. It can actually be the individuals in the room. Okay, so to try and conclude, here's a strategy map that I think that you should approach when debating the CAP-K. If you're negative, the thing that you want to win is sustainability. And we didn't really have time to discuss this at any great length, but I think that it is important to win that, just like in DDEV, that if there is an impact during debate happening, that you win that capitalism is not sustainable. The reason you would say capitalism is not sustainable because capitalism relies on infinite growth and the world has finite resources. And so those two things should be diametrically opposed. It's impossible to have infinite growth when we have finite resources. Secondly, capitalism also kills the environment, and the externalities that exist within the marketplace can't be solved through self-interest alone, because they're problems that the commons exist, and there's always economic incentive to pass things off on to the commons, which is one of the reasons why climate change is occurring, as well as deforestation, the destroying and the acidification of the oceans, etc. The other thing besides sustainability that you want to win is that your links act as solvency turns and takeouts. Think of them as great specific case cards to the criticism, and not only talk about them like this means that they increase capitalism, but talk about discuss in your impacting of these arguments how they influence the case, and either by taking it out or in sometimes making it worse. Another great thing about the CAP-K is that you control the root cause. And if you control the root cause, then they can't ever address the true form. If you win that capitalism is bad and will continue to do bad things within society, you can always win that there's long-term trade-offs to any form of short-term solvency that would be worse than whatever they can self-correct in the short term. And then, of course, it's important to articulate an external impact. With the links, you're always going to be able to say, well, who does CGR better? A socialized world where we move away from capitalism, or a capitalist society where we focus on punishment as the root cause. And you can win that debate, and that's really important. But if you're fighting for the same internal link, it's more strategic that you also have an external impact. With capitalism, that's easy because you can win that resource wars can happen, as well as other forms of environmental degradation, all that can culminate in extinction. You can also win dehumanization type impacts like alienation that we discussed earlier, or commodification of lives, things like that. Of course, if you're AF quickly, it's about saying that there's no alternative, winning that capitalism is sustainable because it is able to drive tech innovation, and that tech innovation can solve problems prior to them becoming lethal. When a solvency deficit to your AF that the alternative won't be able to solve in a short time frame, and that it's imperative that you stop your affirmative impact. Things like you would sacrifice people on death row prior to the socialist revolution having efficacy, which seems silly. You can match the solvency deficit with the permutation and say, obviously, this is not going to, we can fight the long-term fight against capitalism, but we need short-term relief for those people who are on death row. Or you can impact turn and say capitalism is good. If you win that with sustainability, you're also in a great spot. Capitalism has a great impact debate about capitalism good or bad. You can win everything from environmental degradation and nuclear war on both sides to solving asteroids or nanotechnology, good, bad, etc. But all of these are things that you can focus on inside of capitalism. So that's all we have time for in this instance. Later this week, we'll discuss capitalism and critique AFs. I hope that this has been informative about the way that the capitalism has interacted with our criminal justice system and motivated our criminal justice system, and may very well lie at the root cause of our criminal justice system, and why neoliberalism capitalism should be a critique that you should consider reading on this topic. Please let me know if you have any other questions. Feel free to write me an email, and I'm always happy to answer any questions about this. And I look forward to the question and answer period directly at the end of this. This is Josh Clark. Again, I'm the co-director of forensics and head coach at Montgomery Bell Academy. Thank you for tuning in to my lecture on capitalism and CJR, and I hope you all have a great rest of the summer and look forward to the start of the debate season. Thank you.